You know when we're on, Abdullah. I think we should start. It seems that we're on. Welcome, everyone. Glad to have everybody here. Yes, it seems we're on. So, welcome to one more wonderful talk that we're going to have in a few minutes. This is hosted by the UNESCO Chair for Translating Cultures. My name is Andreas Caratsalis. I'm the lab manager for the Translating Cultures lab that we have put together since last year, trying to bring together some of the most prominent voices in the field to talk to us about what does it mean to be entering this new age of translation. And we're very happy to have with us today Dr. Joost Morkens, who is one of the eminent experts in that area. I'm going to just say a couple of things that I read from his bio. Joost Morkens is an associate professor at the School of Applied Language and Intercultural Studies in Dublin City University, but he also has many more hats: the science lead at the ADAPT Center, member of DCU's Institute of Ethics and Center for Translation and Textual Studies, and also a board member at the European Masters in Translation Network. He has published extensively on translation technology, interaction and evaluation, translation precarity, translation ethics, and he is the general co-editor of the journal Translation Spaces. For today, he was very generous to talk to us about something that's of the exigencies here, and AI is affecting us all. So the title of his talk is A Triple Bottom Line for Translation Technology. And I think we're going to hear very interesting things about what it means to be giving equal weight to people, the planet, and performance as we move forward with translation studies and translation technologies. Dr. Joris Morkens, we're very happy to have you with us.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Solis, and thank you very much to everyone, the UNESCO chair and the team at King Faisal Centre for the invitation to Professor Al-Ghadir. I'll share my slides if I may.
Yes, and as Dr. Morkens is getting ready to share his slides, let me also say that if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, and I will make sure at the end of the presentation that we get to ask and answer as many questions as possible.
So for the next hour or an hour and 50 minutes or so, I'm going to speak a little bit on I hope not with not too much digression on the topic of the triple bottom line for translation technology for evaluation. So I'll begin by see if I can make slides work. I'll speak a little bit about large language models and machine translation, the origin of the triple bottom line as an idea from business ethics, and our proposal about a triple bottom line is sustainable translation technology. It's a topical subject, and it's very much I suppose, an opinion piece, and I hope to stimulate a little bit discussion at the end. So, for those of you that aren't that familiar with the history of machine translation from the 1950s till roughly 1980 exclusively meant rule-based machine translation. So now that we have multiple paradigms, this is the retronym that we use, the term that we retrospectively give to the first machine translation systems that were based on rules and a number of lexical items or dictionary items. From about 1980, we had the proposal of example-based machine translations starting to use corpora previous translations This was proposed particularly for the English-Japanese language pair. And then from around 1990, statistical machine translation. So this was quite controversial, moving to purely statistics to figure out what the most likely translation will be for a source text, sentence, or segment. And first reviews of the early papers, one from 1988 by Peter Brown and colleagues. One of the reviews said that the pure force of computers was not science, but slowly but surely, through improved results, statistical machine translation became the dominant machine translation paradigm, right up until the advent of neural networks, what we now know as machine learning. So neural machine translation became the dominant paradigm from 2015, 2016, and more recently, large language models have become the dominant paradigm for well-supported languages. So we've moved from rules to data-based machine translation over time. But one of the other key distinctions is between symbolic artificial intelligence and sub-symbolic artificial intelligence. So symbolic means that what the system is trained on and produces is all human readable. And one of the first things that happens within a machine learning system, and there's something in the chat, I'll make sure it's okay. I'll increase my voice. Okay. So one of the first things that happens within a neural machine translation system, and similarly within large language models, is that words and sentences are converted to numbers, upon which there's thousands upon thousands of different operations carried out. So what that means is that this is not human readable. This is in myself here also, so I'll pick up. Yeah, so what happens within the system is essentially a black box. We can't see what's happening in the system. So the difference between neural machine translation and large language models, well, one of many, is that we move from supervised machine learning, where there's a path from source to target language that the system is trying to repeatedly traverse. And when it's unsupervised or self-supervised, it means that there's no pattern. It's just a lot of data given to the system, and it looks to find patterns in that data. Another change that's happened over time is that we've moved from the primacy of university-based research centers. So every year there's a competitive shared task for trying to find the best machine translation system based on the same training data. So lots of different research centers pit their systems against each other, and they're all evaluated. So from 2016, just when neural machine translation started to clearly be the dominant paradigm, we can see the University of Edinburgh is at the top of the leaderboard for English, German, MetaMind, NYU, so New York University, Cambridge, a lot of university research centers, KIT and Karlsruhe in Germany. By 2019, we can see that big tech is starting to take over. And so Facebook FAIR, Microsoft Systems, and then this is compared to human translation. We have some university systems as well, University of Cambridge again, the e-translation system at the European Commission. But at the very top of the leaderboard, we've got big tech. Now, if we look at last year's scores, again for English, German, not only is it big tech at the top of the leaderboard, it's large language models. So GPT-4 is the best performing system. Unbabel is, again, it's a large language model, but the plucky newcomer with 100 million in venture capital funding from Portugal. So Mistral, another large language model. All these large language models are outperforming neural machine translation. So this is how things have changed over time. Another thing that you might notice is that the scales are different. So in 2016, there was an automatic evaluation metric used. So that was a less than ideal metric that tries to look at a human translation. It's the gold standard, and compare the machine translated output to it. By 2019, we moved to direct assessment, so crowdsourcing, where the crowd, people online for micropayments, will rate the translation between 1 and 100. And we've moved to a new rating system in 2024. So not only have we seen this move from university-led machine translation to large language models and big tech, we've also seen a change in how we evaluate. And it's difficult to find the best way to evaluate the system. The current standard is called ESA, or Error Span Annotation, where they annotate major and minor errors while also trying to give a score between 0 and 100%. That's a lot faster. One of the other things that's happened as we move to large language models, huge tranches of data that the system tries to make sense of, is all of a sudden there were emergent abilities of large language models. So the system, as the system gets bigger, there's more and more data. All of a sudden, these abilities emerge to do with things like arithmetic, transliteration, word unscramble, question answering, multipass natural language understanding. And it's not entirely explicable why the systems have got that much better as we increase our training data. And to this day, the improvements in large language model are largely based on scale, just adding more and more data. So comparing large language models to neural machine translation is quite difficult, because there's lots of things that large language models can do, but also the output will differ depending on the prompt that we give them. So one comparison that was published last year was this one by Intento, where an automatic evaluation metric with some known problems or weaknesses was used to compare PALM2, which is the Facebook large language model, against unnamed, but I think it's DeepL neural machine translation systems using the prompt at the top of the screen. But of course, if we change the prompt, the output is going to be different, maybe of a different quality. Another example of using a number of different automatic metrics from paper by Kadawi et al. From 2023, using 8 different dialects of Arabic. We can see that the best result is GPT-4 with multiple prompts, so 5-shot prompts, giving it some examples. But the evaluation is all focusing on the performance. For Blue, it's comparing against a gold standard human translation. For Comet, it's pre-trained, but still, an automatic evaluation. It doesn't really tell us how good a translation is for a specific purpose. And there's an assumption, as I said, that scaling, just adding more and more data, will have an increase in the capability of the large language models. And that doesn't appear to be the case. So this widely shared paper to do with translation specifically assumes that with increasing scale, that the capabilities of the large language model will increase, and focuses purely on productivity being faster for translators working with the output of these models. Although we've seen from other papers that counteract this argument that larger and more instructable language models are becoming less reliable. So the picture is not entirely clear. So I'll come back to evaluation in a little while. More broadly, OpenAI, they call ChatGPT a general purpose technology. And this links back to what Langdon Winner in 1978 called technology being at its most productive when its ultimate range of results is neither foreseen nor controlled. The positive side effects are, in fact, a latent expectation or desire implicit in any plan for innovation, but the negative side effects, similarly, are experienced as necessary evils that we're obligated to endure. And if we look at those evaluations, they only take into account those positive side effects. They don't really consider what the extra costs might be, what the implications of technology might be more broadly. And there's a great deal of AI FOMO, so fear of missing out, in industries, in governments, in institutions. I work a lot with the European Commission, as was mentioned in Grace's introduction. And there's a big push for AI. Our national governments are pushing for AI. Certainly in Saudi Arabia, there's a huge push in the AI strategy in lots of different areas of society and business. There's a new state of the art for translation and many other tasks. And there's a sense within organizations that if we don't do it, another group will. So everyone wants to be seen to have an AI product. Within the translation domain, the world's biggest by turnover translation company, TransPerfect, have this artificial intelligence page where they talk about artificial intelligence taking on a prominent role in creating and optimizing interactions across many industries. Another, the top translation organizations and language service providers, RWS, unlock your AI potential. In Iceland, they've given all of their language data to OpenAI to try and make Icelandic the second official language of the GPT tools, in the hope of maintaining Icelandic as a successful and widely used language in the digital domain. The likes of OpenAI and big tech companies working with AI have huge money at their disposal. Quote recently that they've raised $6.6 billion in new funding at a $157 billion post-money valuation to accelerate progress on their mission. And here's just an example from the National Strategy for Data and AI from Saudi Arabia. The ambition is to position the kingdom as the global hub where the best of data and AI is made reality, to rank among the top 15 countries in AI. So there's a real question about whether AI is too big to fail, whether so many people are behind it, that even if the outcomes are disappointing, that it won't be. No one wants to be seen to stifle innovation. So even if there are problems to do with data gathering, with copyright, those are largely ignored at present, even though there's a number of legal cases in train. This is something that Anthony Pym, a widely translation scholar, talked about recently, that the public discourse on generative AI is so vociferous, so polarized, so ill-informed, so removed from empirical assessment, that in the space of public discourse, the technology has assumed messianic or demonic proportions. And similarly, the people who highlight these ethical problems can, go overboard and make them seem like they are completely demonic. But then the hype is so strong, it's difficult to countenance. And he also feels that because there's been a lot of stagnation, especially in larger economies, that there's a sense that generative AI is where the growth is going to come. Within businesses, we see huge numbers of language AI companies. Slater's top 50 companies under 50 months old are all to do with multilingual content, audiovisual translation, multilingual video and audio, real-time speech translation, trying to put these together within the AI stack. Computer-aided translation tools that we use day in, day out for translation, all are feeling that they have to incorporate generative AI, but all in different ways. So some have options such as MemoQ, where they'll automatically send a number of translation memory proposals to try and have a more context-aware machine translation. Others, such as Localize, include buttons so that you can, at the click of these buttons, change the phrasing, lengthen a segment, shorten a segment. Some just such as a SmartCat, for example, allow us to adjust the prompt. But there's no single best way for working with large language model yet clear within these tools. Lilt, interestingly, offers multilingual text generation. So from a single prompt, choice of different large language models to produce a multilingual message. So this breaks up the usual source to target relationship. Instead, we've got a single prompt that leads to multiple language versions. So Anthony Pym talked about being removed from empirical assessment, but the challenge is, how might we evaluate large language model translation quality? I talked about the problems with string-based metrics. So string-based means that you've got a string of text that's meant to be the best translation just because it's human usually, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's good. And then you're comparing your translation to this human translation. And the score is based on how different it is, or pre-trained. So metrics that are trained on previous human evaluations, but the likes of Comet has been shown to have weaknesses to do with identifying mistranslations, identifying the sort of things that neural machine translation tended to get wrong anyway. Human evaluation, MQM, multidimensional quality metrics, is probably the state of the art here and has been incorporated into these ISO and ASTM standards, but it's very time consuming. And depending on how much of the modular quality metrics you use, it can be even more time consuming. And there are composite benchmarks to evaluate LLMs in a more comprehensive way beyond just translation. But one of the problems with these is, as I mentioned earlier, that they focus only on performance. And this is something that was criticized in a paper called Green AI by Roy Schwartz and others in 2020, where they wrote about how an exclusive focus on performance when using one evaluation metric or another discourages a holistic approach to AI system development. In the past, this is the sort of argument that's been made by some others, such as Tom Kochman, who have said that the use of the BLEU metric, that string-based metric I mentioned earlier, has really held back MT development because there's a tendency to optimize systems just for performance to score well in that particular evaluation. But the criticism that Schwartz et al. Is that considerations of efficiency and sustainability are ignored in the quest for ever greater performance. And this tendency, they say, pushes AI development in the wrong direction. So I'll come back to that in a moment. But first, I want to delve into business ethics and talk about where we got the idea of the triple bottom line from. So the 1970s created, as per the title of Milton Friedman's article in 1970, was that the social responsibility of a business is to increase its profit. By 1990s, we had this idea of corporate social responsibility, and this pyramid of corporate social responsibility that you can see on the right, proposed by Carroll, where we had the main responsibility, economic responsibilities, to be profitable, to earn money for our shareholders, then subordinate to that, legal responsibilities to obey the law, because law is society's codification of right and wrong. So not just obey the law, but obey the spirit of the law. Then subordinate to that are ethical responsibilities, to be ethical, to abide by society's mores, to do what's right, just and fair, to avoid harm. And then the smallest responsibility is philanthropic, to be a good corporate citizen and contribute towards schools, education, arts, the community, and improve the quality of life. Over time, this sort of idea was put forward by others too. George talking about respecting the rights of employees, consumers, and society in general. And in 1997, in a book called Cannibals with Forks, John Elkington put forward the triple bottom line. So the triple bottom line, which we borrowed in our paper from last year, says that we should look at not just profit for an organization, but also people and the planet. So the triple bottom line is people, planet, and profit. So for people, that an organization shouldn't exploit the stakeholders, the people involved in the production of whatever it produces in that organization. And the organization should ideally contribute to their well-being along with all others involved in the production of their output. Regarding the planet, They should cause no ecological harm, to limit the energy consumption and waste, and carry out a full life cycle assessment of products. And for profit, the economic sustainability of an organization is important because it means that the organization can continue its work. But it shouldn't just include economic capital, human capital, intellectual capital, social capital, and natural capital. So when he came back to this in 2018 to discuss how the world had responded to this triple bottom line idea, Elkington was disappointed. He said he wanted to foment complete system change rather than just one of these being balanced versus another. But the trick here is that this isn't something that we can attach a number to, because that's ultimately reductive. So really, this can only be a heuristic trying to give equal importance to each of these people, planet, and profit elements to maintain the sustainability of our organization and our planet as a whole. Linked to this, Millay in 2019 talked about how the purpose of a company can differ depending on what sort of approach they have. They have a shareholder approach. That means maximizing profits to shareholders, making sure they receive good dividends. A stakeholder approach is trying to look at all of those stakeholders involved in production and make sure that they are all looked after. But a common good approach is looking at all of society and trying to do the best for everyone in society. And he says that taking ethics as a guide for human excellence, business ethics can be a guide for human excellence in business organizations. And he defines sustainability as nothing other than the common good for future generations. And importantly, Millay feels that just because an organization might take a common good or stakeholder approach doesn't mean they're ignoring the shareholders. Like with the triple bottom line, it's important to make sure that there is that sort of economic benefit so that the organization can sustain itself. In translation studies, the field that I come from, there's been an expanding view of quality from the linguistic approaches of the likes of Catford here from 1964, expanding to functionalist approaches, trying to consider what the function of a translation is, and it has to fit its function, otherwise it's not of good quality. Gideon Toury expanded to sociological approaches, starting to take into account the environment, the circumstances, and the political and societal situation. Again, expanding to include these cultural and political approaches from the likes of Maria Tomoshko. So we've had this increasing the larger purview of translation quality that has moved far beyond sort of limited idea just of performance or just of a linguistic quality. In the translation industry, and there are different views of quality too that were summarized in a paper by Fields et al. In 2014, drawing from the work of Garvin and other areas of business. So they categorize these as the transcendent approach, the idea that there is just this perfect, immutable quality. It's an innate characteristic that's both absolute and universally recognizable, or a product-based approach, trying to see does the product or service, is its quality quantifiable based on certain ingredients or attributes. And the user-based approach is really similar to the sort of functionalism we were looking at in the previous slide. It's the degree to which a product or service satisfies users' needs or preferences. Good production-based approach. So this is the sort of thing that's used in ISO standards that views quality as conformance to requirements. So if there are certain ingredients in production, if they follow certain steps, we're liable to produce good quality. And a value-based approach, assessing quality in terms of costs and benefits. The more benefits outweigh costs, the more a product or service increases in value. In the mid-2000s, Christina Abdallah proposed looking beyond just the quality of the product. Does the product satisfy the stated needs? And the process, like I mentioned, the sort of ISO standards, looking at how the work is done and what the source text is like. Looking to the social quality, as part of our three-dimensional quality approach. So social quality is about the interaction and relations of the people and the technology used in the production network. And she felt that these questions of who does what and under what sort of circumstances, the social quality, it affects process quality, which in turn affects product quality. Essentially, this is indivisible. How, if we look at the satisfaction and well-being of the people involved in this production network, this is a really important but often neglected element. And in research, if we think about the validity of our research, usually we would consider validity to mean, are we measuring what we intend to measure, what we purport to measure? But looking from educational psychology, Samuel Messick in 1988 said that key issues of test validity are the meaning, the relevance, and utility of scores, the import or value implications of scores as a basis for action. So if we're going to use these scores or these results of metrics as a basis for action, that affects our validity. Plus the functional worth of scores in terms of the social consequences of their use. So if we're evaluating a large language model, for example, and making huge assumptions to do with its quality based on inappropriate metrics or incorrect metrics, then there might be social consequences because that's often reported uncritically. In 2018, when Microsoft claims that they achieved human parity for Chinese English news translation, this was based on one of these crowdsourced metrics, but further within that same paper, there was an evaluation by humans looking at errors from just a sample of those translations, and it was clear that they had not reached human parity. But because that was the title of the paper and that was reported in a very uncritical way, there were social consequences of their use. Those social consequences were that many translation clients, translation buyers read this and felt, well, are we paying for translators if we would be using neural machine translation? Something else that's happened within the translation industry is breaking work down into chunks, often known as digital taylorism, and it's something I wrote about in 2020. And it links back to a quote from O'Brien that in some domains, the notion of a text with a beginning, middle, and end has changed radically. And a quote from some colleagues from my university, DCU in Dublin, Courtney and Phelan, a quote from one of their respondents from a survey is that translation is now more like working on an assembly line. So this idea that work might be broken down into chunks and decomposed, it has real consequences. An example from this diagram from Unbagel again from Portugal. And here we have a customer submitting a text. It's machine translated. Machine translation is checked sentence by sentence to see if it's reached a good enough quality level. If the level is deemed not good enough, decomposed sentences are sent to the community and they're either post-edited or translated from scratch. Then everything is recombined. The customer gets the translated text. And another example of this sort of decomposition of work occurs within multimedia translation or media localization, as it's sometimes known these days. AVT companies, audiovisual translation companies, are increasingly offering fast turnaround translations. As short as 2-hour turnaround for the translation of premium content into English, breaking the content down into 15-minute chunks, which is translated with the aid of wikis and with neural machine translation within proprietary platforms. And then after an hour and a half to 2 hours, these 15-minute chunks are sent back to a project manager who does a quick check. These chunks are recombined and then sent out. Rationalization within the industry means that once something is translated once, it's unlikely that it will be translated again. And the use of templates for audiovisual translation means that this English language version, with its spotting, its timings, the in and out times of the subtitles, is likely to be the template that's used for all other translated versions in all other languages. And within these sort of limited platforms, it's difficult to conform to the norms of translation. So the sort of thing that we might expect within a translation that's expected, the professional norms to do with accountability, to do with communication, to do with linguistics output, these all become secondary when there's increasingly automated algorithmic management within these platforms. So the expectancy norms relate to the extent to which a translation conforms to a reader's expectation for a translated text. We all have expectations when we read something that's been translated. But as Jarahi and Sutherland said about digital platform work more generally, that increasingly for those working in them, the ability to understand and make use of algorithms has become a core competency of workers attempting to retain autonomy. So I wrote about this last year, about the idea of algorithmic norms within translation, where all of a sudden fulfilling the requirements of the managing algorithm, because that means you'll get more work. This becomes the primary need. Conforming to algorithmic norms, it'll dictate whether a freelance translator will be engaged again or not. Thus, fulfilling the algorithmic requirements becomes a primary need. If we look at the output of Fair Work, the Oxford think tank for translation and transcription platforms, very few of the platforms meet their minimum standards of fair work to do with fair pay, fair representation, fair management, fair terms and conditions. Within the translation industry, there's a quote from Max Derjagan, who is involved with the Audiovisual Translation Europe, Translators of Europe organization, and he says this should be a golden moment. We have insane volumes of work, but instead we have widespread stress and burnout as subtitle translators try to make ends meet. And Minna Ruokonen, who you see pictured here from her work with Aileen Svan last year in translation spaces, if the translation profession is to survive, it needs to be perceived as being worthy of lifelong commitment. This can only be achieved if translators' passion for the intrinsic nature of their work is acknowledged and nurtured, which necessitates granting translators greater autonomy and power over their working conditions. Yet, what we actually see in the translation industry is less and less autonomy, less control, less power. That the work is really being shrunk to a very minimal level, whereby there's an output from a large language model of machine translation that can be post-edited or adjusted, and something that's considered to be perfect, if it's previously been translated, is often grayed out. This links to ideas about motivation, what motivates us in our work. So from the work of Frederick Winslow Taylor, from where the idea of Taylorism, the word Taylorism comes in 1911. From his work since the late 1800s, he proposed this idea of scientific management, assuming that workers are primarily motivated by money, that improved rates of pay will compensate for reduced autonomy, repetitive work. But what we're finding in translation is that there is not improved compensation, but just more and more repetitive work and reduced autonomy. In 1967, Hertzberg proposed a motivation hygiene theory of job attitudes, and he suggested that there are both motivating job content factors and demotivating factors whose absence creates dissatisfaction. So, as workers, we'll be less satisfied if our status is lowered, or if we have less job security, or we have less pay. But the things that motivate us positively are often intrinsic. And the dividing line has been argued about between these motivating and demotivating factors, but it's been shown that these intrinsic factors are motivating: having challenging work, recognition for one's achievement, having a sense of responsibility, work that's meaningful, being involved in decision making, and the sense of importance to an organization. So if we think back to some of those workflows I was talking about, where translators are working on decomposed chunks of work and working within these depersonalized platforms where there's very little communication, and they're working on decomposed sections of text, is that work going to be challenging, Will there be recognition for their achievements? Do they have a sense of responsibility? Is the work meaningful? Are they involved in decision making? Is there a sense of their importance to their organization? Or are they just fungible parts that can be swapped in and out? And in work on work system sustainability, the likes of Doherty and Ina Ennard and Wes Harry, who wrote the book that is or edited the book that you can see on the right-hand side here, and say that this is important, that instead of focusing exclusively on short-term static efficiencies such as productivity and profitability, you should also focus on long-term dynamic efficiencies such as learning and innovation. And for a work system to be sustainable, it needs to attain just balance in development between all the stakeholders involved and both long and short-term needs. And this is the essential message behind UN Sustainable Development Goal 8. While there's lots of criticism of sustained development goals, the idea of sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all, while difficult to measure, is a fairly honorable effort. And a lot has been written about environmental sustainability regarding large language models and neural machine translation. In 2019, in a very influential paper, Emma Strubel and others said that researchers should prioritize computationally efficient hardware and algorithms. LLMs are highly costly and ecologically supercharged. But we do also have to take that in the context of all our other uses of energy. In that paper by Strubel and others from 2019, they estimated that the CO2 emissions from training a large neural network model was roughly the same as the outputs of 5 petrol cars over the 20-year lifetime of those cars. So a lot of emissions, and a lot of the concerns about AI and energy output are to do with more and more people using AI or generative AI. This idea of scaling, but the systems are getting bigger and bigger. But also that, this is all projecting upwards, that there's going to be more and more people using it. There's an estimate that about 300 million people use it now. But all of our governments, all of our international organizations are pushing for more. Within Ireland, the country that I live in, the government has said that they want 75% of businesses to be using AI by 2030. The emissions will also depend on where the energy is coming from. So within Ireland, we use a lot of renewable origin energy. And so for the same experiment carried out by Jimmy Starch-Derrianov and Eva van Massenhoven, former colleagues of mine at DCU, who have now moved to Tilburg in the Netherlands, doing the same or similar work in the Netherlands means that there's a lot more fossil origin energy being used. We take this in terms of the context of our CO2 emissions nationally. Saudi Arabia is at number 10 globally for the CO2 emissions per capita, mostly to do with oil use. And the world average for CO2 emissions per capita is 4.293. So this is, of course, very high, but how much of that is linked to generative AI is a whole other matter. In Ireland, we have a lot of data centers. 21% of our national energy output is used for data centers, and that's probably higher than in most countries. But all of that output from data centers is not just for generative AI. The worries again are just projecting upwards, and in fact, we'll produce far more emissions, use far more water by watching something on Netflix for 10 minutes than having lots of ChatGPT queries. So this idea of projecting upwards is something that the head of the National Grid in the UK talked about, how the power required for data centers is going to increase 6-fold in the next decade, where future growth in foundational technologies like artificial intelligence and quantum computing will mean larger scale, energy intensive computing infrastructure. So at the moment, the main emissions are to do with training these systems, not so much from answering questions or inference. But nonetheless, if the systems are getting bigger, there's going to be more and more users, then this will become a major concern. And even though systems are becoming more efficient, the trajectory is still currently upward. And we're seeing mixed messaging to do with this use of energy. And so to do with language processing, there's been these announcements recently by Grok in Saudi Arabia. Today, Saudi Arabia is not just participating in AI, we are leading it. Datavault planning a new 1.5 gigawatt huge data center campus in Yams Oxagon. In Ireland, we have a moratorium of data centers. So since 2022, there hasn't been any further data centers being permitted to come online because we just don't have more energy capacity. So we're starting to see these implicit threats from big tech companies. This Amazon boss from the newspapers last year saying there's a major risk to Ireland as long as data center ban remains. So essentially, Amazon, they employ 4,200 people who are well paid within Ireland. And if they're not going to be able to build more data centers, then they might just take those jobs elsewhere, is the implicit threat. And AWS is the sort of building block, the cloud infrastructure that's used by so many of our different tools and cloud tools that we use. But if we do look at scale, asking ChatGPT 50,000 fewer questions is going to be a drop in the ocean with regard to the amount of CO2 emitted by something like a transatlantic flight or a one-way European flight. I flew to Singapore for work in January, and that's probably going to involve more CO2 emissions than my large language model interactions for most of my life. If one person living car-free has a huge implication. If we look at the amount of water in gallons used for queries, 300 roughly ChatGPT queries is estimated to use up about 1 gallon of water, but eating one hamburger uses up 660 gallons because of the intensity of to do with farming and production of beef. And so for those of you who are vegetarian and eat vegetarian burgers, then your gallons are 90% less on average. But, if we take this in scale, while we might not want to, use up much water, and for our generative AI use, just eating less meat is going to make a far bigger difference. Another worry, though, is the exacerbation of the global digital divide, which between haves and have-nots, between those that have access to internet and those that don't, between those that have access to generative AI and don't. And this disparity is liable to grow larger. I read an article during the week where it was to do with translation, and the idea was that sooner or later that all translation will be automated, and it will end the digital divide or the hegemony of English. But that can't possibly be the case when we see huge disparities in the amount of language data available. There's far more data available in English than in any other language. So the quality is always going to be better in English. This is going to cement the hegemony of English rather than break it down. So with all of this in mind, back to evaluation. So our proposal was to apply this triple bottom line idea to evaluating large language models and technologies more generally. So not people, planet, and profit, but rather people, planet, and performance. So look at the implications of our technologies for people. And does this technology or this large language model impact them? So not just the translators whose data is used or who might be unilaterally have technologies imposed on them and being told you have to use the output of this large language model. The people that annotate this data, there's huge numbers of people annotating our large language models for trying to make sure that the output isn't offensive or culturally inappropriate. Reinforcement learning using human feedback tries to prevent inappropriate output. And this, of course, is affected by geopolitical situation. We have platform workers, we have those whose data is used without permission. There's huge data dispossession. All of the people who wrote books that were pirated and shared via the LibGen system and then used for LLM training. So how does this technology impact? Then planet, looking at the energy costs, CO2 emissions, focus on building efficient models, but also the ICT cost and disposal. A lot of rare metals are used in the production of our ICT materials, and then in disposal, it's very expensive to dispose of ICT tools in a safe way, and there's a lot of unsafe disposal taking place in less developed countries. A lot of it takes place in unsafe circumstances in the likes of Kenya and Cambodia. Then when we're talking about performance, not just performance using a standard benchmark, but trying to use task appropriate and comprehensive standards. And it's not like companies don't want to be ethical. There are a small but growing selection of companies within the translation sphere and more broadly that are foregrounding ethics and the common good as part of their mission, that take ethics as a business model. And if successful, these can prove to be powerful exemplars of ethical behaviors for others to follow. There's the company I buy my coffee from in Ireland. They espouse that very strong ethical guidelines, and they give a lot of their money to good causes. They give 1% of their turnover to a number of different causes, pay their staff well, and that means that people are happy to buy their coffee. But the challenge for companies like these is to balance financial sustainability with ethical behaviors. And an increasing number of translation companies are B Corporation certified, which means that there's a score on 5 different criteria out of 200. And if they get over 80 on those, then they have B Corp certification and have to recertify every 3 years to publicly show that they're attempting to be an ethical company. But if they publicly espouse these behaviors, it leaves them open to challenge if they fall below their own standards. So an example is the company Parallel in France was bought over another company and then didn't pay legacy debts to freelance translators and were rightly challenged online because if they're B Corp certified, then they should carry through with their ethical behaviors. But it's challenging to balance this in a very competitive environment. The company that won the European Association of Translation Companies and Ethical Business of the Year report in 2023, AJT Translations, it announced that it was closing down about a year later because it was difficult to maintain ethics along with cash flow. This might change to do with the expectations of artificial intelligence. A quote from the European Language Industry Survey here is that artificial intelligence, it's beginning to frighten translators. It was primarily considered an opportunity in their 2022 survey, but by 2023 is now mainly perceived as a negative trend, possibly based on ChatGPT coverage in press and forums. And that trend continued in 2024. The 2025 results will be announced in March. And this hype cycle for artificial intelligence produced by Gartner Research, we can see that generative AI is just at the end of the peak of inflated expectations and starting to fall towards the trough of disillusion, where perhaps the expectations will become a little bit more realistic. It's really, is it possible for AI to fulfill all of the promises that have been attached to it? And right now, AI is a huge loss leader. There's a lot of money behind it, but not money being made. This sort of message is appearing in newspapers and media occasionally as well. This article in the Washington Post about the AI hype bubble deflating. Now comes the hard part. Busy, the tech industry got the world's attention with AI. Now it's busy persuading people to pay. In November, there was discussion of OpenAI and others seeking a new path to smarter AI, as the current methods focusing purely on scale hit their limitations. And there is work toward more efficient language models, work by Stu et al. On contrastive preference optimization to match or exceed the performance of the previous winners in those shared tasks I mentioned. Several researchers have talked about knowledge distillation, which means having a large parent model and then a smaller student or pupil model that learns from the larger model, but is far more efficient. And that's what appears to be used for the training of DeepSeek, and the system that was launched from China in the last number of months at much lower cost than those huge American AI systems. Although DeepSeek also is another example of how the geopolitical situation will influence the output of a system. This can be seen when certain questions to do with China's histories are asked of the system. Of course, some people like Sam Altman from OpenAI deny that there is any barrier based on increasing the scale of systems. And finally, we don't just have to use the largest language models. And this is something that myself and colleagues talked about in a recent textbook that we published called Automating Translation. So at the top right, we have closed source large language models like those from OpenAI, maximized for performance on a wide range of tasks where the environmental impact is high, but this impact in training data and the true cost are hidden. There are open source models like Llama from Facebook and Meta, where the LLM is maximized for performance, but the training data is transparent. But also smaller language models that are fine-tuned for specific tasks and might outperform the large language models on these. And even open source small language models that we can organize and control locally, that we can adjust as we wish, that can perform well on a small number of specific tasks with little environmental input. The example in our book was one that's freely available. And if you search for AdaptMLLM or AdaptNMT, and my colleague Seamus Langford created a system whereby you can have a small, locally controlled language model with a green report that shows you exactly what the environmental impact is. So we're approaching the hour, so I'm going to finish here. But in closing, John Elkington, when he first proposed the idea of the triple bottom line, stressed the need to change from an extractive approach, trying to extract everything we can, to modes which over time actively rebuild economic, environmental, human, and social capital. This seems like a good ideal. Donella Meadows in 2001 talked about working with systems. We can listen to what the system tells us and discover how its properties, our values, can work together to bring forth something much better than could ever be produced by our will alone. So she's very positive about it. She feels that working with systems and working in conjunction with systems will bring good outcomes. But the key word here is values, trying to make sure that it works with our values. So looking forward, we need to balance people, planet, and performance. And the question is how to do so. And while our proposal is very much an idea, heuristic, it's not something that we can append scores to, but it's certainly something that we feel, myself and my colleagues who proposed this, so that's Sheila Castillo, Federico Gaspari, Antonio Terrell, Maya Popovic, feel that it's a good ideal to aim to. But for all of us, ethical concerns need to be considered, whether we're technology developers, translation buyers, agencies, translators, educators, consumers of translation. And as educators, our graduates are going to move into influential positions in industry, whether it's the translation industry or more broad. So if we try and forearm them with methods for ethical decision making, and even make them realize that these are ethical decisions. The hope is that they'll bring forward evaluation beyond performance and start to question the validity and the implications of the evaluations that they carried out and the decisions that they make in their future. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Morgans. That was a wonderful talk, and I know that for all my colleagues who are thinking now of this year's theme for the chair of translating cultures, this is a wonderful introduction to some of the core issues that we have to contend with. I know we have a couple of questions in the Q&A, and you can add more questions here. I just wanted to make a quick comment and start off the discussion by saying that you have described that tension between optimization and performance to efficiency and obviously sustainability. I've seen that kind of discussion more and more recently, even for more straightforward engineering, let's say projects at MIT, mechanical engineering, all kinds of things. And what it comes down to very often is, are we talking about a zero-sum game? Is there a world where we could have both? Or is it always going to be, and especially in terms of evaluation, um, only based on optimization, is it always going to be a world where we're striving for better performance, but not necessarily getting to good in the sense of having all these other metrics such as sustainability or the ethical considerations be accounted for?
It's difficult to predict, isn't it? I mean, um, the the message certainly from the most recent US government is very much in one way. It's focused on not seeing the global population as a society where we're all dependent on each other. And so if we don't have political leadership that believes in that view, then this sort of idea of a meritocracy where there, it's a zero-sum game, as you say, that's going to hold sway. And it's hard, that I keep feeling that we've reached a tipping point where the implications of the changes to the environment, the huge wildfires that are taking place in parts of the US, the crazy temperatures in many parts of the world, including in Saudi Arabia and in many areas of the Middle East, in Southeast Asia. Last year, I was in Thailand in May for a study with people from Myanmar on their use of machine translation. And the temperatures were in the mid 40s, real feel 51. 80 people had died that month of heat stroke. Yeah, at the same time, the Thai government has just agreed to build a new data center just outside of Bangkok. So, it's I like to think that we'd reach a tipping point where the realization would come that we need to try and strike this balance, but it's hard to be entirely hopeful. I wouldn't be, and it's not just as you said. There's lots of people making this sort of argument, so I don't want to make any claims that this is exclusively our argument at all. But personally, my view is that there's a place for technology. I'm technology positive in general, but within reason, and trying to take into account the importance of trying to strike a balance, and making sure that we aim towards an ideal society that's inclusive of everyone and planetary well-being.
Thank you. That's very inspiring. We have a few questions from people who have from participants who have some more practical, pragmatic questions. So
Okay, shall I look at the questions that are on the Q&A?
yeah, you can look, but I can tell you, Dr. Abaladi had a question about how can we balance AI-driven efficiency with the economic, social, and environmental impacts on the translation profession, and if AI enhances or threatens the integrity of translation as a human skill.
So we've done a number of surveys of translators and their use of AI, and when they've chosen to use AI, and many translators appear to have chosen to use AI, they tend to use it for things other than translation. So rather than something that limits their autonomy, their choice has been to use it for assisting with communication, for example, or for searching for terminology, for searching for appropriate terminology. And I mean, that's separate to the argument to do with CO2 emissions, but in terms of working with it and threatening the integrity of translation as a human skill, they're trying to use it as a value add. And the counter argument is that a lot of companies are using it as a way to reduce costs, primarily to reduce labor costs. And while some of us would like to think that those that focus purely on cost and reducing labor costs, that the quality hit will be enough that customers would push back. In practice, that hasn't really happened that much because not all translation needs to be perfect. Sometimes translation customers or those that are watching subtitle TV, for example, can be quite forgiving. They can fill in the gaps themselves and, won't always complain or won't always switch off. So it's a challenge to try and balance this sort of efficiency with an economic, social, and environmental impact. And it really needs leadership from, larger organizations to try and take this on. At the moment, the organizations that are trying to be ethical are still relatively small, although Paralink did have an acquisition, so it means that they're a decent size. When I showed you the chart from the Oxford think tank of different digital platforms, and the one at the top is Creative Words, and I met the owner of Creative Words, Diego Crescieri, a couple of months ago, and I asked him about what sort of changes he had to make to his terms and conditions to achieve that top rating. He said he had to make quite a lot of changes. And I said, have you seen the benefits? Have people made that positive decision? Have they, voted with their feet to choose your platform? He said they have not. So, it's tough, and it's while we might make that argument, it's difficult in the current environment for a company to survive based purely on ethics. They need to compete in a number of different ways. So I'm afraid that's not a straight answer. It's the best I can give. Thank you for the question.
Yes. And I think a couple of the other questions point in that direction. They talk about, how do we resist work conditions that do not take people into consideration, or how do we move away from looking only at profit? And even a question on the very practical side, if it's okay, I guess, to have to rely primarily on AI translators and then have proofreading essentially services offered, which changes the dynamics between human and AI translators. So are these practices going to change?
The translation industry is large and multifaceted. So, we see lots of different practices taking place. the question to do with, is it shameful to rely primarily on AI translators and only proofread, especially for people majoring in translation? I would hate to use the term shameful because, it's really down to your own decision of what you feel is appropriate, rather than having some guy from Dublin dictate that to you. But of course, it's been shown over time that if a task is automated, then our ability to carry out that task is lessened. It's very difficult to measure that precisely, and I don't know that anyone has for translation specific. But if you're majoring in translation, the standard thinking, I suppose, is that you need to work up that translation muscle to be able to identify the sort of errors that are output by our automated systems. And we've had a number of different evaluations where we've compared professional translators with years of experience with student translators. And sometimes it's very tricky to spot the errors in automatic translation because it tends to be very fluid and has been since the dawn or the advent of neural machine translation. So that experience is important, and that translation skill is important in identifying those errors. And those errors can be critical. I mean, there are standard typologies for translation errors, and at the lower end, they're not huge. There's a risk of mistranslation, but at the higher end, according to Carmen Canforan and Gail Goffman, we have the risk of financial, legal implications. We have the risk of injury. We have the risk of death. So if there's a mistranslation of a crucial bit of information from, a medical device instructions or a medicine label, this could have real implications. I'm involved in a study at the moment with Harvard Medical School and Boston Children's Hospital to do with patient discharge instructions. So they found that there were negative outcomes for non-English speaking families when their kids were awaiting discharge from hospital. And they had to wait 2 or 3 days for a human translation. So they wanted to see if they could use large language model translation and what the implications would be. So we used that MQM evaluation method, human evaluation that I mentioned during my talk, and found that actually the human translations did include several errors, quite a few, major errors and mistranslations of terminology. So we have this assumption that human translation is perfect. A lot of these automatic metrics are based on having this human gold standard that we compare to, but often the human translations have errors in them too. So LLMs appear to have similar quality. By law in the US, it's required to have oversight, and I think because of the risk of hallucination and inappropriate output, it's really, really important to have that oversight. But at times, the greater good is to use automation rather than just protecting translators. And in being involved in that study really also made me sort of question myself: am I trying to encourage automation and encourage that these translators aren't employed in the future? But then what's the greater benefit to these kids who have negative health outcomes when they stay in hospital for extra days, or they can get out of hospital sooner and their families can look after them at home and they don't have these negative outcomes? Our next round of that study will be with Haitian Creole, so I assume that's a low resource language. The results will be entirely different. I think I digressed quite a long way from the original question, but it's a complicated matter.
It's a very important point, and I think it can lead us to that last question that we have here, because what you were describing with the Harvard study mostly has to do with questions of fact. So it probably is related to medication adherence or something of this sort, where the translation could be quite straightforward in the sense of what do you need to do? What are the next steps? But if we're talking about questions of value or quality, or as we have a question here, the innuendos and the specificities of cultural and religious thoughts and themes, could AI fully translate, is the question, these kinds of more complex thoughts?
Well, something that I touched on in the talk was the geopolitical situation and how we're starting to see the influence of ideology, not just at the level of training data that's used to train systems, which is of course going to have a big effect on output, but also reinforcement learning using human feedback, which is the point after inference, where where system builders can adjust what's output. So the original reason for reinforcement learning using human feedback was to make sure that LLMs didn't produce anything that was inappropriate, vulgar, culturally insensitive. Because the very first large language models used to produce very insensitive output and would be prompted to produce very racist output, for example. And that was a huge embarrassment to companies and developers. There was an educational large language model that was produced by Facebook, intended for research at one point, and that was taken offline within days because it was very quickly prompted to produce racist output. That was an embarrassment for the company. But now we're starting to see changes based on the geopolitical situation. The example of DeepSeek. And if you ask DeepSeek a question about, for example, the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989, it will not give you an answer. And you can see lots of situations around the world that big tech companies, who we're increasingly reliant upon for many of our different cloud-based systems, and certainly for a lot of these large language models, they're very willing to capitulate to the wishes of governments. And an example would be how last week Google quietly removed from its ethical standards the promise that generative AI would not be used for surveillance. And was it surveillance? What was that the term they used? So I think it was surveillance, and that was quietly removed from the terms and conditions last year because that's not the direction that the Trump government wishes to go in. So first of all, we have the question about the innuendos and specificities of culture and religious thoughts and themes. And there's been lots of evaluation of how well or otherwise large language models and MT can translate literature. These sort of specificities, it tends not to do well on. It doesn't tend to produce dialogue well. There's a sort of standardizing, flattening effect. And so something that's written as if it should be spoken, all the training data tends to be written data. So it's not going to produce anything that well. But then we also have this added layer based on reinforcement learning using human feedback that is, again, adjusting our output, shifting it in a way that might affect how appropriate the work is, particularly regarding cultural and religious themes.
Wonderful, thank you. It seems we have one question that's not from the translator perspective, it's more from the company perspective. How would companies navigate the trade-offs between maximizing performance and maintaining ethical standards?
But it's certainly challenging. The efforts that the likes of that company I mentioned, AJT Translation, made was by very publicly espousing those standards. And it didn't work for that company. But then I look at other translation companies that are doing very well with this as their selling point, not trying to compete purely on cost, but making very strong connections with communities and espousing those ethical values in a very public way. The company I'm thinking of is one that's based in Brisbane, Australia, but you know there are plenty of others that have been very successful by taking, at the very least, what I would probably call a stakeholder approach, if not a common good approach to their business. But it's difficult. It's not every business owner or person working for an organization is good at making those connections or making those arguments publicly, while still having the capability of getting the sales in. And it's challenging, but certainly for some organizations and companies, it seems to work in their favor to try and behave in an ethical way, and it actually has a positive business outcome.
Thank you very much. Dr. Morgans, this has been a wonderful conversation. I know it's getting late in Riyadh and probably late in Ireland as well. Let me thank again Dr. Morgans for a wonderful talk, and I hope we'll have more opportunities to discuss. Let me thank the King Faisal Center for hosting us, for hosting this talk, and obviously the UNESCO Chair for translating cultures. We've learned a lot from what you had to discuss with us, and I'm sure we'll have many more opportunities to discuss again. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Katsolis. Thank you, everyone, for attending, for your questions. Thank you to the King Faisal Centre, the UNESCO Chair. It's a real pleasure and a privilege. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.